Now that 10th edition 40k is a bit more established and we've had our first balance updates, let's talk about which are the strongest looking armies in Warhammer 40k and why. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k and tournament results and taking a look at which factions are doing best in the first run-up in 10th edition. In this video I thought we'd examine the top of the meta as opposed to go through the entire list of armies in Warhammer 40k and just focus on the armies that really seem to be the ones to beat right now. Obviously at the moment 10th edition is still very much in its early stages. People are in the process of figuring out what's best and adjusting their armies to suit. And of course as we go along, Games Workshop has already thrown in a big balance update into the mix, handing out a few choice nerfs particularly to Aeldari and Imperial Knights. Seems that Imperial Guard got caught in the crossfire as well. Not that they were doing particularly well before the nerfs, to be honest. Even though some of the top stuff has been toned down a bit, at least early impressions seem to be that it hasn't really knocked the armies affected particularly out of the top spots, and there are plenty of strong armies out there that are unaffected as well. I thought we'd talk through a few honourable mentions, then go through the 5 top armies in the game by the stats at the moment, and talk about what people are choosing to run in their lists. First up, before we get into the list proper, here are just a few honourable mentions, armies that haven't really missed out on the top spots by all that much, at least in terms of win percentage of games and tournaments. Towards the upper end of Warhammer 40k, we've got Necrons on 47%, Chaos Space Marines, Tyranids and Chaos Demons all on 48%, and Deathwatch and Black Templars representing it for the Marines on 49% and 51%. All of these armies definitely have their strong stuff. Necrons with their immovable blocks of warriors that just dominate one objective, Chaos Space Marines with scary Terminator or Chosen bricks led by good characters, plus some devastating fire support from Forge Fiends. Tyranids might arguably slide a little bit down these win percentage rankings, seeing as they've had some nerfs handed out to their faction, in particular to Biovore seeding Spore Mines, though most of their strong stuff is still good. Haraspexes, Lictors, Shielded Hive Tyrants and Barb Gaunts are some of their stronger units. Chaos Demons seem to be doing quite well, often fairly monster mash lists. Bellicor can shield a bit of shooting in the early game as well, and it seems that Deathwatch are perhaps being the most effective shooting Marines at the moment, with their turns of buffs comboing quite well with Oaths of Moment, and also special issue ammunition stratagems. Black Templars can be very tanky with the right vows, and can make good use of things like their very cheap Crusader squads, or big bricks of Terminators backed up by some Dreadnoughts. I was kind of interested to see Space Marines quite so far down the rankings, down at 46%. I know it's a bit of a faction that can often have a little bit of dilution from newer players entering the hobby, but certainly doesn't look like they're one of the top factions right now, and a lot of these numbers come from before the Desolation Marine nerf as well, even if I guess it's not exactly a unit that literally everyone has access to, given that it's not on sale officially yet. It's certainly not like they were winning absolutely tons of tournaments with the Desolation Marines while they were fighting at full power still, often getting beaten down by some of their top tier armies that we'll talk about. At some point in the future I'll try and do a bit more of a complete stats run through and talk through performances for every single army, maybe when we've got a couple more weeks of data built up. Until then though, let's get into the top 5. First up in 5th place we've got the Thousand Suns with a win percentage around about 52%, slightly above most of the other ones that we've just mentioned. Only one big tournament win, but they have placed quite well in plenty, and it does seem that just a few factions have really been hogging just about all of the tournament wins recently, so even other good armies aren't getting a whole load. Competitively, their play rate is pretty high for them, around about the 7th most popular army in tournament games at the moment. Quite good for them overall, as perhaps a slightly more niche Chaos Space Marine army. I think a lot of people were expecting Thousand Suns to be doing rather well when their index came out. They do have a lot of decent supporting rules and can bring some seriously nasty damage combos to the table. Perhaps the biggest one being with sorcerers leading blocks of Rubik Marines or Terminators into battle, giving them ensorcelled ammunition and buffing their damage output every which way, removing saves and having Magnus to give you +1 to hit and wound, and plenty more including full rerolls and sustained hits. It can near enough guarantee that you can delete any single one unit that you want to from the game. Otherwise, their Kabbalistic rituals are really quite powerful as well. The big one ignoring saves is absolutely amazing, but the double move one is pretty good, and Doom Bolt for a bunch of mortal wounds definitely doesn't hurt. Even the pass-fail save one is kind of good value, just due to its low price tag and guaranteeing you a saved model. As for strong units in the army, Magnus the Red is often leading up the force these days. Massive combat and psychic damage threats in himself, can potentially be turning over battle tanks in a single turn, and also is a good synergy piece with a +1 to hit and wound for psychic attacks. Usually the Vortex beasts are just really good all-rounders, massively powerful melee, really good and flexible shooting, plus some mortal wound spam, hard to go too far wrong, they're quite tough as well. Scarab Cults and Rubric Marines can hold down their objectives and receive the big damage buffs, with various sorcerers, particularly just the standard one, for supporting in the unit. Overall, just in general, they seem to be a hard army to overcome, particularly when played well. I feel like they're perhaps an army that needs a little bit more careful play than most in 40k, for when to make the most of the Kabbalistic rituals and unload the big damage combos. They can be a little bit slower than most on the table as well, and most things that'll take down Space Marines take down Rubrics and Terminators really quite easily. Precision shots could snipe out some Sorcerers maybe, and plenty of units in the game have really quite strong psychic defense. Anything with 4+ saves against psychic attacks is going to be bad news for the Thousand Sons with the way that they like to get things done. Next we've got the Golden Armoured Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. They seem to be a strong army, perhaps a bit of a gatekeeper army in Warhammer 40k right now. Lots of really quite powerhouse models, winning around about 53% of tournament games at the moment, though no big tournament wins that I've seen so far, even if they have had plenty of high placings and seem to be doing okay on an individual army level. As mentioned, the tournament results do seem to have been quite heavy on just a few factions, the ones that we're going to get onto. Custodes are being played in really quite big numbers again as well. They're quite an easy army to get into with a low model count access. A lot of people join them with the great Christmas box that they have recently. They also tend to have a fairly uncomplicated playstyle as it goes. Loads of raw might and guardian spear melee on objectives. It's often hard to go too far wrong with them. Speaking of which, the mainstay of the forces tend to be big blocks of custodians armed with guardian spears. 5 attacks each with strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2. It's a fairly solid all-rounder in 40k at the moment, particularly with Martial Qatar to give you things like lethal hits if you need to try and punch up against some tougher stuff. Big blocks of custodians can be really hard to beat in melee for armies that need to kill things in close combat, as if they're on objectives then you can have a fights first stratagem, basically meaning that you get to hit your opponent with all that damage before they even get to strike. They've also got a rather powerful stratagem for resurrecting a custodian each turn for 1 command point, really quite nice just for raw might on the board, and also getting closer to your opponent or getting on objectives, as a lot of armies might just be a bit stat checked by the Custodes. They've got tanky stat lines with toughness 6, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, plus mortal wound defense as well. A lot of small arms and things are just going to be near enough useless against them. For the units that are being used in game, typically things like Custodian Guard, Wardens or Aeldari Terminators are making up the mainstay with those Guardian Spears. The Custodian Guard get big damage with full wound rerolls if they're holding objectives, plus a double flurry of their auric weapon shooting once per game, which is pretty powerful. Wardens are really tanky with a character, and Aeldari Terminators can take down some of the enemy's biggest stuff. For leading them into battle, Blade Champions can give them a really big threat range, Shield Captains free stratagems like that Resurrector Custodian one, and Trajan Valoris can give them a big edge in combat with his Moment Shackle. Seems that at the moment the most popular Forge World units are Caladius tanks for some supporting fire for the Custodian Guard, really quite nice generalist gun turret stat lines, and they're fairly hard to kill as well. As for countering them, some of the other top dogs just have enough raw damage to crack their tough profiles, which they kind of rely on as they can't really hide too well. Most of the other 3 factions, as we'll mention, tend to have the raw mights just break down their defensive profiles over the course of the game. Lots of armies are bringing tons of anti-tank weapons at the moment to help deal with knights, and all of that's generally quite good for killing custodians, as you often just basically have to treat them as tanks. They'll also generally have more trouble against shooting armies more so than combat, given the easy access to fight first. It's often going to be better to lay at least the majority of them low at range rather than in combat. Next up, and third out of the 5, we have the Imperial Knights. For the first few weeks overall of the Leviathan meta, it looks like they've got a 58% win rate or thereabouts. I would expect this to drop down at least a little bit following the points nerfs. Some of the data from that is after the points nerf, but some is before. A fair few typical knights lists tend to often include 2 big knights and a whole bunch of armigers. In general, those lists might have lost around about 100 to 120 points worth of value depending on the knights. A few might have lost a bit more, but I feel like majority of knights lists might be skewing towards more armigers these days. Overall, I feel like they'll probably be one of the top 5 factions to beat still. Their big stat lines and raw damage and defense still keeping them through. For tournament wins so far in 10th edition, they've won 5 big ones, and one of them was since the balance updates, which kind of implies that they're not going to be struggling too hard since then. And they are a very, very popular competitive faction at the moment. Again, quite an easy army to get together, similar to the Adeptus Custodes, 4th most popular faction overall at the moment. As for why they're strong, the Imperial Knights are just a bit of a raw strength beatdown army for the most part. A lot of armies that aren't gearing up with tons and tons of anti-tank weapons might just get a bit stat checked. Small arms and things like heavy bolters just won't be particularly effective even against armigers these days, and they're not too bad at shrugging off even dedicated anti-tank weapons with access to things like rotate ion shields, plus a 6+ feel no pain type save that every single model gets and is very helpful for them, and that can even go up to a 5+ feel no pain if they slay the enemy warlord. On the damage side of things, most of the knight weapons are just murderously powerful, whether it's the 18-shot Avenger Gatling cannon or the enormous double shooting of the rapid-fire battle cannon, and the Armiger thermal spears are pretty bitey for melter weapons as well, actually having strength 12 so they can deal with tanks well. All of that gets a little bit better with the big rerolls from Lay Low the Tyrants, rerolling 1s to hit and wound, though I have seen some reports of tournaments playing that in different ways. Still outstanding for an FAQ on that one from Games Workshop, it is quite an important rule for the faction. Then for supporting things, they've got some useful enough enhancements and some very nice damage and defensive stratagems, including one for focused armature damage and one with a big +1 to wound against big targets for one of your bigger knights usually, and it turns into a free stratagem if you manage to kill the target outright. Finally, the towering rule is pretty powerful in 10th edition as well. It's hard to hide from the firepower, particularly on certain tables. The enemy might struggle to hide their most important stuff behind terrain. For units in the army, particularly given the points changes, the Armiger Warglaves are pretty standout. A lot of lists have been maxing out the 6 that you can take of those. Maybe a Helverin or 2 for hovering around in the backfield, and out of the Questoris Knights, Canis Rex, the Knight Crusader, the Warden and maybe the Paladin are all quite nice versions of them. Quite a few knights like to take a Vindicare Assassin as well, as they can be quite popular to try and trigger the Slay the Warlord oath if you get a chance, or just be an annoying lone operative and try and plink some supporting characters if your opponent doesn't give you that option. As for counters to them, some armies just deal with heavy armor a lot more easily than others. Knights seem to have fairly bad matchups comparatively against Aeldari and Space Marines. Aeldari with all their re-rolling anti-tank guns and the ability for some big mortal wound hits, and Space Marines with their awesome moments. They can also struggle a bit for sheer firepower against hordes. A lot of their attacks tend to be a bit anti-elite or anti-tank in nature, and they might struggle with the regenerating monstrosities of the Genestealer Cult. Speaking of which, second on the list though are the Genestealer Cults themselves. These guys appear to be on a win rate of around about 64% at the moment, really quite standout in 40k, and well above the power curve of the majority of the rest of the armies, and that gap between them and Knights is probably only likely to widen more given that the Knights had some nerfs. They've won 4 big tournaments so far, which is pretty impressive for such a niche faction, and though their competitive play rate is sort of mid at around about 13th most popular out of the armies, this is still massively above average for Genestealer Cults, which just tend to be played not very much at all. Genestealer Cults are a hard army to deal with for quite a lot of factions. Their main thing that really intimidates people is that when their units get killed, they respawn. You can put down Cult Ambush tokens, ideally where your opponent can't quite reach them, and then the unit can reappear on the board a turn or 2 later. Otherwise, their stratagems give them plenty of powerful tricks, including things to drop very close to the enemy, which can be quite helpful for tactical objectives, as well as reaching some things that your opponent doesn't really want you dealing direct damage to. For stronger units that seem to be making their way into quite a few lists, deep striking acolytes can drop off a bunch of demo charges. They're perhaps one of the best ways to deal with hard targets. You get quite a serious amount of high quality shooting from them. The mainstay of the army's midfield often tends to be neophytes though, big shooting blocks with a whole bunch of seismic cannons with layered buffs stacked on them, things like Primuses, Ridge Runners for AP, the Nexos, Cult Ambush, and the Stratagems. Even though their actual aggressive profiles are a little bit on the tame side, once you get that little lot going, they can be dealing significant damage to most units in the game. Aberrants can be really quite mighty, and they could infiltrate deploy if you want to, for the potential for a very scary first turn Alpha Strike charge. And Jackals with their Jackal Alphas have the potential for a whole load of mortal wounds, averaging around about 11 if the opponent gets too close to them, never mind the actual damage output that the Jackals can do, and the fact that they could do some fairly big screening maneuvers as well if they needed to hold the enemy back for a turn. I think it's fairly clear that Genestealer Cults are one of the game's very top armies at the moment, winning vastly more than the vast majority of other factions, and some armies might realistically struggle against them. An unending horde can be hard to deal with in the first place, never mind one that seems to have enough damage output to take down some of the biggest threats to killing them. I guess a few fast moving units to push back ambush tokens could help a little bit, though it can often be quite painful just trying to throw units up into the midst of the enemy army where they might just die to counter attack anyway. Having more chance against them might require taking a bit more anti-infantry firepower, where a lot of people seem to be taking tanks to take down things like Wraith Knights or Imperial Knights, so I feel like they're doing quite well just on their own raw strength, but also operating very differently to how a lot of the other armies tend to. Finally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, hovering around the top spots, we have the Aeldari. Tournament win rates are around about 66%, 14 big tournament wins over the course of the first few weeks of 10th edition, and at these big events seem to be the most played faction competitively, though maybe a little bit less so following the nerfs that they'd have. They do seem to be tailing off a little bit. The Eldar certainly got a few choice nerfs from Games Workshop's first balance update of 10th edition, limiting their fate dice power and putting up a few key units like Fire Prisms, Wraith Knights, Night Spinners and D Cannons, but despite all of these changes it doesn't really seem to have knocked them off the top spot particularly. Two of those big events were since the balance updates, so that heavily implies that out of the few events that they've been at since, the Eldar are still doing absolutely fine. I wouldn't be too surprised if the win rate slips a bit over the next few weeks, but at this point it seems kind of unlikely to me that they're going to turn into any sort of mid-tier faction in the short term. They've still got an enormous amount of strength within their codex, even if the edge has been taken off some of their very best stuff. I think quite a lot of the strongest options for Eldar are fairly well established now. Fate dice with Farseers to turn them into 6s is nice on all sorts of units, particularly with things like big shots overwatching or devastating wounds to get some automatic mortals from heavy wraith cannons or D cannons. Even though you can't throw all your fate dice into those these days, there's still plenty of other big things that you can do with them, making very long charges or passing saves on an invulnerable of 4 or 5. There's lots of good options. Their anti-tank weapons are really savage, with bright lances being at least fairly cheap on a fair few platforms, plus in the battle host they get a reroll of 1 hit and 1 wound roll, which just makes the efficiency of those weapons go enormously higher than it perhaps would have been otherwise. Then they back it up with a bunch of usable enhancements and some awesome stratagems, including Phantasm, which is a kind of godly movement shenanigan. Getting to move a unit in the enemy turn after they've moved is just super powerful. Means that you can have a unit just disappear out of line of sight somewhere, or move back when it was just about to be charged. With all that supporting stuff, there's just so many good datasheets to apply it with. Farseers and Autarchs are generally staples for leading the army, Autarchs just rustling you up command points, and Farseers doing fate dice shenanigans and giving units -1 to wounds. For anti-tank, Fire Prisms, Hornets and War Walkers are all quite common choices. They combo really nicely with the rerolls, and Fire Prisms are just brutal with the damage 6. D-Cannons and Wraith Knights both have the option to hit things that are normally behind obscuring ruin terrain, and they're great targets to fire in a 6-faced dice to get a bunch of mortal wounds for automatic. Wraithguard with a Spirit Seer are another very popular competitive choice, a big tanky frontline unit that gets 2 return fire when it gets shot, and the damage output is fairly scary as well, with a whole ton of Wraith Cannons, again with devastating wounds. And then supporting all of that and maybe running around doing mission objectives, you can have things like Wind Rider bikes with scatter lasers or shuriken cannons, Shroud Runner bikes, Warp Spiders with massive 24-inch moves, Shadow Spectres with good firepower and move shoot move, and cheap rangers to start in the midfield and can actually be fairly scary at sniping, particularly if you take Illic Nightspear along. With that little lot, the Eldar really have just lots of options for strong units to play, and it still seems that people are pretty much happy to use Wraith Knights, D-Cannons, Night Spinners, and the Fire Prisms, even though they all went up. I've seen all of those in top performing lists, even after the points adjustments. As for countering them, most armies just perhaps lack the raw strength to deal with them right now. Certainly one of the top factions in the game. When you get to win rates that are in the mid to high 60s, I feel like for most armies, playing against Aeldari is going to be an uphill struggle if the other player is optimizing their list and playing kind of well. In tournament stats, it seems that they notably seem to struggle really hard against Genestealer Cults, perhaps countering them particularly nicely. The Genestealer Cult units can often have just enough damage output to really punish Aeldari units where they might have struggled against slightly more tougher things, and they often get the Alpha Strike with their shenanigans. Plus, being a Horde army, they don't really care about lots and lots of Bright Lance shots that reroll hits. A lot of that might just be kind of wasted in killing Horde models, when it might have been super effective against things like, say, Knights or Custodes perhaps. Still definitely one of the armies to beat, and I certainly wouldn't be too surprised if both they and Genestealer Cults don't get some heavy balance adjustments in the next balance pass. In any case, hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think of 5 of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k right now. Let me know any other strong combos for the armies that I might have missed, and any other ways that you might have thought to beat some of the top dogs if you happen to be playing against them. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, or you'd just like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.